Darkness settled over the Tunisian highlands as the last traces of sunlight bled across the stony ridges. The air was cool, almost silent, broken only by the distant rumble of engines deep, mechanical growls rolling through the desert floor. It was March 1943, and the German crews of the 10th Panzer Division waited stiffly inside their Panzer III and IV turrets, observing dust clouds rising on the horizon. They had fought the British, the French, even the Soviets, but what they were about to face would leave them unsettled in a new and unexpected way. Through binoculars, Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer spotted something approaching dark silhouettes, moving with the slow, confident pace of armored beasts. At first, he assumed they were more British tanks, but then the shapes sharpened. The hulls were smooth, too smooth. No rivets, no bolts, just a seamless, hardened shell gleaming beneath. The dusty haze. The welding lines caught the last orange light of the setting sun like scars on steel. Something about them felt different. He lowered the binoculars. Amerikanisch Panzer, he muttered. For weeks, the Germans had heard rumors. New American. Tanks, welded, not riveted, built with an industrial scale the Reich could only envy. Reports said these tanks could take hits that would have shattered older Allied models. The German High Command had dismissed some of these claims as exaggerations until now. Now the tanks were here, rolling toward the battlefield with the unmistakable squared profile of the M4 Sherman. Its armor plates fused together in clean, continuous seams to the German crews. Welded armor at this scale was impressive, even unsettling. They had seen welded hulls before, but not like this, mass-produced with a level of uniformity that hinted at an industrial giant awakening. The Panzer IVs, though formidable, were built in smaller numbers with more handcrafted processes. These Shermans, by contrast, looked identical like machines stamped out of the earth itself. As the American column moved forward, the desert. Wind carried the faint metallic clang of treads and the low murmur of engines tuned for endurance rather than speed. The crews inside the Shermans felt the tension as well. Many of them were young, new to North Africa, still learning the harsh realities of desert warfare. They knew the Germans were experienced tank fighters, but they also trusted their machines. Welded armor meant fewer weak points. A rivet couldn't shear off and become deadly shrapnel inside the tank. The hull was stronger, more rigid, and better able to deflect shots that might otherwise penetrate. Inside one Sherman, Sergeant Thomas McVeigh steadied his breathing. Sweat gathered under his helmet, even in the cooling night. He had grown up around steel mills in Pennsylvania and knew the strength of molten metal shaped under heat. He had seen welders at work, sparks raining like meteors as steel plates fused together. When he first learned that the tank he would be commanding was entirely welded, he'd felt a quiet reassurance. Fewer things to break, he often told his crew. Fewer ways for the enemy to get in. Across the valley, the first artillery shells shrieked overhead. German guns opened fire, white-hot tracers streaking against the dim sky. The Shermans continued forward, treads grinding over sand and rock. Explosions burst around them, flashes of light, clouds of dust, the sound of shrapnel pinging off steel. One round slammed against the leading Sherman's glacis plate. Sparks flew, but the shell ricocheted upward, leaving only a scorched mark across the welded seam. Inside the Panzer IV, Fischer stared in disbelief. "Hit again," he ordered. The gunner adjusted and fired. Another impact. Another deflection. This was the moment that stunned many German crews. The welded hull didn't shake apart. No rivets popped off, no plates buckled. It held clean, solid, almost monolithic. For years, German engineers had focused on precision, form-fitting craftsmanship, and complex engineering. But here was a different philosophy altogether. Brute industrial strength rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Welded armor wasn't just stronger, it represented something far more troubling. It represented American capacity. The battlefield erupted into chaos as both sides exchanged relentless fire. Dust swallowed everything, engines roared. Commanders shouted orders over rattling radios. A Sherman beside McVeigh's took a direct hit to the turret ring. Welded plate cracked but held long enough for the crew to bail out. German gunners shifted focus as the American formation pressed forward, their tanks performing reliably under fire. The Germans were skilled, disciplined, and lethal when positioned well. But this night marked a shift not just in armor design, but in psychological warfare. The sight of dozens of nearly identical welded tanks advancing without hesitation hinted that the Allies were fighting a different kind of war, not a war of elite machines produced in small batches, but a war of numbers, industry, and endurance. As darkness deepened, tracer fire illuminated the desert in violent flashes. The Shermans continued to advance, grinding the earth beneath their tracks. Fisher watched through his gun sight, trying to steady his nerve. "So veal," he whispered. So many, the welded armor had held, and behind each tank was a factory producing more. As the night battle reached its height, Fisher realized they were not just facing machines. They were facing an entire industrial nation, welded together with steel and purpose, a force that would only grow stronger as the war went on. And the Germans, for the first time in North Africa, truly felt it. It was only the beginning. The echoes of the Tunisian night battle did not fade quickly. For both German and American crews, the confrontation was more than an exchange of fire. It was a revelation. Morning light revealed the battlefield with harsh, unforgiving clarity. Burned-out wrecks cast long shadows across the sand. Some were American, some German. But what struck the German recovery teams most were the intact hulls of several Shermans that had been hit repeatedly yet refused to break open. Temporary scars, scorched seams, and dents marked where shells had slammed into their welded plates. But the structural integrity held firm. This was the first time many German officers examined American welded armor up close, and their initial reaction was one of grudging respect mixed with unease. From a distance, Hauptmann Rolf Schneider, an engineering officer attached to the 10th Panzer Division, surveyed one of the disabled Shermans. He walked his gloved fingers along the smooth fusion of the glacis plate, noting the consistency of the welds. "Industrial, sehr industrial," he murmured. "Industrial, very industrial." In Germany, armor manufacturing leaned toward craftsmanship, with meticulous plate fitting and machine finishing. But this American hull, built in Detroit or Cleveland or one of dozens of U.S. factories, bore the marks of a nation that treated tanks like production line tools, not artisanal weapons. It was an approach that disturbed Schneider. Germany could produce excellence, but not at this scale. And certainly not at this speed. Across the lines, American crews were learning their own lessons. McVeigh stood beside his Sherman, examining the long, blackened streak where an 88mm round had hit the front plate and skidded away. His crew gathered silently, each of them realizing how close they had come to being incinerated. "Armor saved us," McVeigh said quietly. "Welds held." The words were simple, but in them lay a new understanding of survival. Welded armor didn't just protect the machine, it protected the men who lived inside it. As the campaign progressed, both armies began adapting. The Americans brought in more Shermans M4A1 South with cast hulls, M4A2S and A3 South with welded hulls, creating a mixed force that still shared a crucial strength: structural durability under fire. The Germans, meanwhile, found themselves forced to rethink their assumptions. For years, their crews had trusted that a well-placed armor-piercing round would crack open Allied tanks, especially older riveted models that often failed catastrophically. But now they faced armor that distributed impact across welded seams, reducing internal fragmentation and keeping plates from shearing away. This shift affected German tactics. Panzer crews began focusing on flanking shots, aiming for weaker side armor. Tank destroyers like the Martyr series sought longer engagement ranges to punch through with higher velocity rounds. The famed 88mm anti-tank guns were still deadly, but the margin for error was shrinking. The Americans, with their growing numbers of welded hull tanks, could afford to take risks that earlier Allied forces could not. In April 1943, as the Germans prepared for what they knew would be their last major operations in Africa, Reports flowed in describing encounters with American armor that absorbed punishment beyond expectations. The welded hulls paired with the Sherman's reliability were not individually superior to German tanks, but they shifted the dynamics of attrition. Germany was bleeding tanks and experienced crews it could not replace. The Americans, by contrast, were feeding an industrial furnace that burned hotter every month. Intelligence officers on both sides collected fragments of armor for testing. German metallurgists noted that American rolled, homogeneous armor combined with strong welded joints resulted in fewer penetration failures when struck by mid-caliber munitions. German analysts were not impressed by the thickness. They still believed their Panther and Tiger armor was unmatched in quality, but what troubled them was consistency. Every plate of American steel, every welding line, every seam was nearly identical. This suggested an industrial system capable of mass replication without losing structural fidelity. Meanwhile, the American crews grew increasingly confident, not arrogant, but reassured by the construction of their machines. When one Sherman was destroyed, another rolled in to replace it. Factories back home were producing more tanks per month than Germany could manufacture in 4. Welded armor played its part. It reduced production complexity, allowed faster assembly, and improved battlefield survivability. What the Germans viewed as crude, the Americans saw as efficient, a fundamental philosophical divide in wartime industry. Yet even as armor technology advanced, the human experience remained central. Sherman crews, despite feeling protected, still faced terror every time a German shell whistled toward them. Likewise, German tankers, though aware of their tactical superiority in many engagements, felt the psychological weight of facing a foe that could absorb losses and return stronger. Letters written by German tankers during this period described frustration, not over the Sherman's firepower, but over the way American armor withstands hits that should have torn it apart. Leadership decisions on both sides reflected this shifting reality. In Berlin, High Command urged development of heavier tanks to counter Allied numbers. This led to accelerated production of the Panther and Tiger, machines that prioritized thick armor and firepower over ease of manufacturing. But these tanks were slow to build and difficult to maintain. Hitler's obsession with technical superiority only widened the gap between German craftsmanship and American mass production. In Washington, U.S. military planners emphasized mobility, repairability, and sheer output. Welded armor fit perfectly into this vision. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George Patton recognized that wars of material and endurance favored the Allies. Patton famously appreciated the Sherman's balance, calling it a good tank, though he acknowledged its vulnerabilities. Still, he trusted that the United States could outproduce any losses. The desert environment shaped everything. Dust, clogged engines, heat-warped metal. Night battles were disorienting and brutal. For the Germans, the slow realization that American welded armor refused to break apart easily led to uneasy adjustments. For the Americans, discovering that their tanks could take hits and keep moving forged a new kind of battlefield confidence. But the lessons of North Africa were only the beginning. As the Germans withdrew and Africa fell to the Allies in May 1943, both sides knew the next confrontation would be larger, more destructive, and fought on ground that held far greater stakes, the welded tanks that had surprised the Germans in North Africa were already heading for their next battlefield. Europe, and there, the true test of American armor would begin. The gray morning sky over Normandy on June 7, 1944, carried the distant thunder of artillery rolling in from every direction. Smoke drifted through hedgerows like torn, ghostly veils. Fields were cratered, roads churned, barns splintered, but the American advance was pushing inland, and with it came the same welded machines that had rattled the Germans in North Africa, the M4 Shermans, now rolling across the thick bocage country of France. This time, the German crews knew what they were facing, but they were not the same soldiers who had fought in Tunisia. These were battle-hardened tankers of the Panzer-Lehr Division, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet armor and survived. And yet, as they watched the American formations advance, that old familiar unease returned. A group of Shermans crawled forward along a narrow farm lane, their engines droning steadily. Every weld seam, every plate of armor bore the imprint of American industry. Here, on the Western Front, German tank crews once again found themselves studying those welded hulls with wary eyes. Unlike the desert, the hedgerows favored ambush tactics. A Tiger tank hidden behind thick foliage could wait until an American tank approached within 50 meters, fire a single round, and disappear. A Sherman's welded armor could not stop a Tiger's 88 millimeters from the front at close range. German tankers knew this well, but they also knew that every time they destroyed a Sherman, another seemed to appear. And then another. And another after that. It was a grinding pressure, not tactical, but psychological. In one engagement near St. Lay, Oberleutnant Marcus Adler watched through the gun sight of his Panther as a column of Shermans emerged from behind a ridge. They moved in staggered formation, cautiously, guns scanning. The Panther's 75 millimeters high-velocity cannon barked. The lead Sherman burst into flames. But before the smoke even settled, two more Shermans edged forward, continuing the maneuver. Their welded armor, though no match for the Panther head-on, kept their silhouettes unbroken under fire until they reached cover. Adler's gunner swore under his breath. "Sie kommen einfach weiter," he muttered. "They just keep coming." This was the reality German crews struggled to internalize. They had better guns, better optics, often better trained crews. But the Americans had something Germany could not match: production. The welded hulls were visual proof of that industrial dominance. Panther and Tiger crews knew their tanks were masterpieces, but masterpieces are slow to make. The Panther required precision assemblies, hand-fitted plates, and careful machining. The Sherman required speed, welding lines, and the power of Detroit's assembly plants. The Americans understood their own strengths. They knew welded armor wasn't impenetrable. But they also knew that survivability came not only from thickness, but from repairability in numbers. Field repair crews often welded patch plates over damaged areas within hours, returning Shermans to the fight. Where German units sometimes abandoned crippled tanks due to lack of parts, American mechanics rebuilt theirs on the roadside. Welders in olive drab jackets worked beside the tanks at night, sparks showering the ground like fireflies. Each repair was a symbol of persistence. As the summer wore on, the Allies pushed deeper into France. The Germans fought skillfully, inflicting heavy losses, but always the Shermans reappeared. And behind every Sherman was a logistical chain unmatched in the war. German tankers reported encountering American armor even after destroying dozens in a single day. For many, this relentless presence eroded morale far more than any single engagement could. The decisive moment came in late July during Operation Cobra. The breakout from Normandy relied heavily on armored thrusts. And again, Sherman columns spearheaded the advance. Bombers shattered German positions, and American tanks poured through the gaps. German armor, still formidable, found itself overwhelmed not by individual duels but by movement constant, coordinated, and backed by numbers that defied battlefield. Attrition. During the breakout, Panther crews attempted to reposition across open fields south of St. Lay. American fighter bombers strafed, artillery pounded, and Shermans advanced in waves. The welded hulls, though vulnerable to heavy German guns, resisted fragmentation and glancing hits long enough for the tanks to maintain momentum. German units were battered, isolated, or encircled. Tankers, who had once mocked the Sherman, now saw it as the core of a machine that Germany could no longer shut down. By August, the Falaise pocket closed. German armor was trapped or destroyed. Panzer crews, abandoning their tanks, glanced back at the wrecks of their Panthers and Tigers masterpieces, undone by the crushing weight of Allied production. The Shermans, their welded hulls scarred from weeks of battle, rolled forward again. The war moved into Belgium, then the Netherlands, then Germany itself. Each front saw the same pattern repeat. German tankers fought fiercely, inflicted losses, but ultimately could not stem the tide. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, German crews again encountered the familiar American armor. Snow coated the tanks, muffling engine noise. Panthers ambushed Shermans in forests and villages, often destroying them in 2 or 3 shots. But as ice thawed and fog lifted, American counterattacks surged forward, their armored units replenished. Faster than the Germans could respond, for every Panther lost, Germany struggled to replace even one. For every Sherman lost, America replaced dozens, and so welded armor, simple and sturdy, became more than a technical design. It became a symbol of the Allied strategy: build fast, build strong, build many. German crews who examined captured Shermans late in the war wrote in their reports that American welding techniques, while simplistic, produced consistent structural integrity. There was no artistry, no elegance, only reliability. That reliability, multiplied by thousands, became decisive. By 1945, when American tanks crossed the Rhine, many German crews had abandoned their vehicles due to fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, or lack of ammunition. Shermans rolled across bridges built overnight by U.S. engineers, their welded bodies reflecting the dawnlight. When the war finally ended, the Germans who survived often spoke with a mix of frustration and respect about American armor. Not because it was stronger than theirs, but because it never stopped coming. Welded hulls were the visual reminder of a war Germany could not win, a war of factories. Fuel, manpower, and steel shaped by fire. In the quiet years that followed, historians looked back and saw the truth clearly. The Allies were not victorious because their tanks were perfect, but because they were present, persistent, and repairable. Welded armor had transformed the Sherman into the most produced tank of World War II, a machine that helped carry the war from North Africa to the heart of Germany. And long after the guns fell silent, the lessons endured: simplicity, consistency, industrial power over technical perfection. The welded hull of the American Sherman became a symbol of how wars are won, not always by the best weapon, but by the weapon that arrives, survives, and returns again.